So what did I say today was? Six and
Sores.
did we say sores?
And animals or something.
Yeah. Let's do
Livestock
and sores. Yeah. Okay. So good morning. We'll start. This will be lesson 6, which we'll call livestock and sores for the sake of reference. So if you happen to want to watch this at some point in the future, someday, which, you know, there are a lot of reasons you'd want to, I'm sure. But the it is a YouTube page or a
channel,
YouTube channel, not YouTube. You're not on there, but it's called Norm's Bible Study. And so I just looked at it, and it actually is findable, which is something. And we already have 4 subscribers. So, and I'm one, and John's one. So, I owe it all to Johnny and his brother-in-law who are doing all the work and so on. It's very nice. Eventually, we'll have a link from the church website. There is a link on the church website to a couple others. If you ever get interested and you want to study, I feel like it'd be fair. And this is not, I'm not trying to be self-promoting because I don't want that. But I think it'd be fair if you want to study one of these topics, you could watch this with somebody and they have some discussion points, makes it a little easier than just reading scripture sometimes. I think people get a little scared of scripture sometimes, just because there's so much of it, it's a little overwhelming. And I think maybe it makes sense to be able to do a little study that way if you want to, and that'd be great. So I appreciate always all the comments and all the discussion. I think we have a lot of good discussion. It's a joy to me, and obviously I like it. I like to be here and to be able to study these things. So I hope you can catch fire with that with friends too. That'd be a great thing. So this morning's trivia question is just a little more challenging because this isn't scripture we talk about much, but I believe you can find it because you know where it is. But we discussed that after the Israelites entered into Egypt, it was 430 years later to the day that they departed Egypt. So this has to do with dates on the trivia question, and it is, how many years after the Israelites left Egypt did Solomon begin to build God's temple? So that, and I'll tell you, it's not predicted, it is historical. So it's on the Solomon builds the temple side. So when Solomon started to build the temple, it's referred to as how many years after the Israelites left enslavement. And that's the trivia question this morning. We have a bunch of teens heading out to camp today. I was just down there telling my son goodbye for camp. And so be in prayer for them. The heat has gone down, the forecast, so it's only supposed to be 102 most days they're there. But it was going to be 107 tomorrow, I think, so it's gone down to only 102. But, you know, hopefully they, I think there's shade up there somewhere. There might be a pavilion if it hasn't melted. And they may have air conditioning, we hope. We'll see. But it's a hot summer. Reminds me of last summer was a little more tolerable. We're going to talk about a little more tolerable this morning too, in the context of some of the plagues. And it's interesting how the plagues seem to build. Not only did God attack the false gods of Egypt, as we've been talking about, but he also built the misery factor in as it went along so that the people would turn more and more to him. And remember that it was as much about the Israelites turning back to God, realizing that Jehovah God is God, as it was about establishing before Pharaoh, the person who perceived himself to be the greatest man on the earth at the time, it was all about showing Pharaoh who God is, but it was about showing the Egyptians as a nation and about showing the Israelites that they can trust God, that they should trust God. Remember, it was 430 years. They spent 400 years-ish in slavery and needed to be reminded that God is God. All right, so anybody got that answer? Yes? 480 years. Very good. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get the source. So that was over at 1 Kings 6:1, and you probably could find it in Chronicles too, but we'll look at 1 Kings 6:1. in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So again, God gives us amazing detail down to the day of the beginning of the temple. And there are so many more things I could say about the plan for the temple and where the temple is located and the threshing floor of Aruna and all those things that we won't get into this morning. But it's not just a rote detail, nor a road detail, but it is a plan that God had for his people, and it all makes sense. And so you may wonder, why 480 years? And the reason I was looking at that actually was because we were talking about how the Israelites came out of Egypt in 1446 BC, and that was 480 years later, so that was whatever that comes out to, 966 BC, that he is building the temple. Does that add up? Yeah. So, but why 480? And that's a fair question. I don't think anybody really knows, and it doesn't say, but what would you figure? You got any ideas? Any just little off-the-wall thoughts?
12 times 40?
Yes, 12 times 40. Excellent answer. So 40 years, let's say that the Israelites spent 40 years in the desert wandering before they went into Canaan, because they did, right? And that if each tribe paid a price of 40 years before the temple of the Lord could be established to be a structure at the capital, Jerusalem, the city of David, the threshold of Aruna, that was the recompense, essentially, 40 years per tribe, 480 years later, 12 times 40. I think that is to me, the most logical answer. I appreciate that answer because I think it makes sense with the way the Hebrew happenings occurred, which may be a little redundant or possibly even repetitive, but it all makes sense in the way the Hebrew language works, with symmetry and with timing and with God's will for his people. So we've talked, and I wrote these down to make sure I'd say them right, that we talked about Happy, the God that was considered the establisher of Egypt and the controller of the Nile with the first plague, with the plague of blood. We've talked about Heket, the goddess who was portrayed as the head of a frog, the goddess of fertility, water, and renewal, and the plague of the frogs was the second plague. We talked about Geb and the gnats, the mites, the critters coming from dust. Geb was the god of the earth, or dust, and the dust became gnats or mites or lice or any of those, and attacked the people. And then fourth was Khepri. The fourth plague was the plague of the flies. Khepri is the goddess of movement of the sun, the rebirth of the day, renewal every day, and was portrayed as the head of the fly. And of course, that was the plague of the flies. And so last week we mentioned very briefly, and we'll finish it today, Hathor, Hathor, was the god of love and protection. And for reasons unclear to me, Hathor was portrayed as the head of a cow. And so, of course, the plague was against the livestock that was left out in the field. So we're going to read that one real quick just to catch the end of it. So we're at Exodus 9, verse 1. So that is the fifth plague. Those of you who are astute will note that there are 10, and so we're about halfway through them. And we're talking about the connection of the hand of God and the god of the flies, in terms of Beelzebub and people. When Jesus brought about a miracle by the hand of God, the finger of God, that he was accused of being Beelzebub, in cahoots with Beelzebub. And what he said, of course, was, if I am serving Satan or Beelzebub, why would I cast out demons in that name? And so, by the finger of God. So there was a tie-in to the way God interacted with the people, that the people of the day would understand, because they studied this stuff a lot and they knew it. So let's look at Exodus 9:1. The Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. The Lord set a time and said, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found out that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, he would not let the people go. So I want to talk about that for just a brief moment, that Pharaoh actually sent investigators to find out if this is true. You know, Pharaoh went from proud, I am the most important person on this earth, and he frankly still was the most important person from an earthly standpoint as the king of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the land or on the earth at the time. And, you know, at first he has magicians reproduce the plagues with the blood and the frogs. And then after that, they couldn't reproduce the plagues. And they said, back at chapter 8, verse 19, the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. And it says right above that they could not, they tried to produce gnats by their secret arts and they could not. And they said, this is the finger of God. So the magicians were kind of coming around. And now Pharaoh, I think, was starting to be sort of chiseled away in his facade of importance in terms of realizing that something was going on that was far beyond him. And in sending investigators to find out about the animals, I think that's pretty interesting. I think he wanted it to be more than just a rumor. You know, the story is the animals of the Israelites didn't die in this plague. But what he found out was, it was really true, that the Israelites didn't have their animals attacked by this plague on the livestock, the plague that was out in the field, or the livestock that was out in the field, I should say. Any other comments on that one? Because, yes.
I'll make this quick. Just
Sure.
As the fast forward, I don't do a spoiler report, but at the end of the 10th plagues, Pharaoh changed his mind again, got on his chariot,
Yes.
and went after the Hebrews. Well, in this the plague of livestock also included horses.
Yes.
And donkeys. So
you're wondering why?
Where did they get the
Excellent.
horses for the chariot?
Yes, and I will answer that with this phrase at verse 3. The hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field. And so what we discussed, and last week briefly, and I don't mind re-mentioning because I think it's very important, was that this seemed to be that if they listened to that and said, oh, you know, God's going to attack the ones out in the field, let's bring them in, shelter them. And I'm sure that Pharaoh's horses were sheltered, that it was the livestock in the field that were attacked. So, and that is a great question, not only from the standpoint of the horses for the chariots, but when the Israelites left Egypt, they plundered the nation of so much wealth. And a lot of that was livestock they took with them that the Egyptians said, you know, your God's really in charge. We'll gift you with all this value. If they were all dead, it wouldn't be much of a gift, you know. And so I think that it was a distinction that perhaps these were the unattended, the kind of poor livestock anyway, the people who just wouldn't listen and wouldn't put them away and said, oh, you know, it doesn't matter, or maybe just didn't even have a shelter. But I believe if they were sheltered, they were fine. If they were not, they became deceased.
I think
Yes.
it points out also that it was truly God, because out in the field you've got the livestock. When you have a disease that
Yeah.
affects livestock, it's indiscriminate about whose it is.
Absolutely, excellent.
And the
point.
fact that here's
Yeah.
a cow that's an Egyptian cow, it dies, the one next to it that didn't die if it was
You know, that's a great point, that out in the field, what you're saying is out in the field, you can't really discriminate as to whose livestock is whose, and if it
Disease
only
would
hit
pass.
the Egyptian and left the Israelite if they're together, or, you know, I was thinking what you're going to lead up to was if they were wearing masks and didn't spread disease, that perhaps it was God-born, not airborne, and, you know, it is interesting that the specifics of how it came about was just as God said. and down to the specific of tomorrow this plague will begin. And I think that is such a key faith building issue too, to show that this was the hand of God. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't trying to predict, I think there's going to be an illness coming and you gotta wait for a while to see it happen. This was tomorrow this happens. Yes, ma'am. Interesting question. Her question is, since the Egyptians were enslaving the Israelites at this time, is there any evidence that perhaps when they lost their livestock, they go and try to sequester the Israelites' livestock as their own? I don't know that happened, and my most reasonable guess is that it didn't, because I think the people were afraid at this point of the Israelites. I think they were afraid of the God of Israel. And I think it would make it unlikely, but that certainly Pharaoh could take what he wanted. He was still Pharaoh. He was still in charge. And that's a very interesting question. I don't know that there's any evidence of that one way or the other. But if they did, they would get healthy livestock because the Israelites' livestock was protected. Excellent point. So now that brings up the fair question that's only a discussion point that doesn't have a proof in Scripture. And that question I keep getting from people off and on is, how long did the plagues last? What kind of time frame? And by most accounts, most people believe it was a year. And the reason for that was that some of them are mentioned like the next day, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, or a week later, they, did the next action. But that based on the timing of what would be the most destructive against the false god. In other words, during the time that the false gods' theoretical services were in use would be when God would want to attack them. And so, for instance, you would want to hit the Nile when it was the spring, and the time for the surge of the Nile that would bring blood onto the land, so that there was blood everywhere and the fish were dead, and then the frogs came next. And if you look at the seasonality of it, it would take about a year to get through that, including, as we'll read about in a moment, like for instance, the locusts and then the hail that destroyed crops. It's very hard to destroy a crop in the field that's not growing in the field at that time. And so if you have that crop growing and virtually ready for harvest and destroy it, that's a much more meaningful impact against that false god of that wheat, for instance. So roughly speaking, it's probably somewhere around a year. And so this process, certainly they could have had more livestock born, more taken, whatever. But I think the key issue is it was the ones out in the field. The Lord, verse 4, will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. That might even bring up the issue if it changed ownership as to whether it was then subject to death, and I don't think there's evidence for that. So, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land, that was verse 5. And then, of course, Pharaoh, after sending the investigators, verse 7, not even one of the animals the Israelites had died, yet his heart was unyielding and he would not let the people go. I don't want to repeat the discussion about Pharaoh and his hard heart at all times, or each week. But I do want to just mention, we've talked about how that's a theologically tough issue as to whether Pharaoh could have yielded. What would have happened? What if he had said, losing our livestock was enough. Let us go. And I think two things are really at play there. I think one is God knew he would not. And this was all about the lesson to the Egyptians and the Israelites as to who is God and how God's power always exceeds that power of the false god, the demon, the satanic individual, whatever way you want to look at the spiritual warfare side of that. And the other is simply that Pharaoh was selected to be the point of the lesson to the nation of Egypt and to the Israelites. And we in the New Testament era, I don't think we'd be comfortable with that at all. To say, this person has this plague so that other people will benefit spiritually. But in the Old Testament, there wasn't choice. There wasn't, there was sin punishment for the sin of some individuals in the nation of Israel. There was punishment to the Canaanites because they lived in Canaan, and that's where God intended for his people to live. And it was a very different era. So I think it's always important for us as Christians to realize we're thankful to live in the era of grace and forgiveness and mercy and individual relationship with God. I'm very thankful I was not alive during the time it was a corporate punishment of the nation for sins of the nation. I think we'd all be in trouble from that. And I think it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to have an individual relationship with God. So I think it's very, very, very valuable to study Old Testament events and the character of God relating to his people and to other people. And remember, a lot of Egyptians left with the Israelites. It wasn't like he said, I'm going to annihilate the Egyptians. He just was proving his point as to who God is. But I think given that, it's extremely valuable for a study of the Old Testament, but I don't think we should extrapolate law from the Old Testament into law for people today. And there are people that sometimes use discriminatory approaches because of how God told the Israelites, annihilate this people, don't intermarry, don't mix, don't whatever. And all those things were dead on the cross. And Christ rose up so we could live as new creatures. And I think it's important for us to keep that perspective. Any comments while I'm about to choke? Excuse me. I'm having coffee number 1 today. As he set these up, I have 2 here. Don't worry. It's a rather small looking cup. It tastes pretty small, but it's okay. I'll get my antioxidants. Don't worry. All right, so we're going to move on from Hathor. If everybody is done there, yes. Let's go. So Exodus 9:8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss them in the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become a fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land." Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. This was against the goddess Isis. And you know the term Isis, the name Isis, because she's kind of famous in lore. There are TV shows, there are movies, there are all kinds of things. Shazam, I think, took her on at some point or bonded with her, I can't remember. And, there are just a lot of references to Isis. Isis is one of the more memorable false gods of Egypt for whatever reason. But Isis was considered to be the goddess of medicine and peace. And I think that's a really interesting thing, that the goddess of medicine was attacked with sores on the body that could not be fixed, could not be healed. And as of course, I'm in medicine, I find it always difficult and frustrating when there's something that just won't heal. I've even referred to myself as being like a bad abscess that just won't go away. There are times where you just have a sore that you just can't get to heal. And it's frustrating because, we have all these various different techniques and processes and medicines and surgeries and procedures and poultices and various washings and whatever, and sometimes you just can't overcome them. And that's what the people of Egypt were facing here. And so when you look at why was she the goddess of medicine and peace, and I think the simple answer on that is when something is sick and sore, like a boil on the skin, you are not at peace because you have a miserable sore. Some of you have been through that personally. And when you can't get comfortable, that's a very difficult thing. So let's read the rest of this now. So he took ash, became a fine dust over the whole land of Egypt. Festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land. Verse 10. So they took some soot of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on men and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So think about that. You know, we've already talked a little bit about the misery of having gnat bites, louse bites, or chiggers, or whatever the mite was from that one. We talked about how the flies came right after that, and flies like to find a sore that's been scratched or open for whatever reason and land there and do things like lay their eggs that become larvae and treat you miserably in that way. And this would then be a boil. So what is a boil? There are various terms. There's abscess. I'll answer this. You don't have to worry about that. There, terms are like, there's a term called fair-uncle, which I always thought was interesting. I always thought of myself as a fair-uncle too, to my nieces, but it's a fair-uncle is an abscess, a non-healing sore. That's kind of an older term that has to do with the tissue. And then there's abscess or boil. And what it really is that as opposed to scratching and having flies come and pick at, your blood, feed off your blood on you, this has depth. And so it digs into the tissue and is deep. And one thing I've observed, because I hadn't really said anything to gross people out yet this week, is that when there's an abscess, it's almost always deeper than anybody can believe. I mean, I'll see somebody with an abscess on their arm and they'll kind of say, oh, why don't you just poke it and drain it? And if I end up doing that, it's often like this deep before you're into it. It's just, it looks like it's superficial. So we're talking deep.
An example of that is, I was raised on a farm. We had a lot of cows and hogs and stuff.
Uh-huh.
The ones that got bit by snakes
Interesting.
always turned into a boil.
Really? That is interesting. So what he said was he was raised out on the farm, and of all the things that happened to the cattle, sheep, whatever, that if they got bit by a snake, it would always turn into a boil. My presumption would be that'd be because of the depth of the fang, as opposed to just a bite on the surface. But that really is interesting that's an observation. And it's always shocking to me too. I was at a friend's house once while I was still in residency, and he had some cattle, and what he mentioned, why the calves had this little abscess on his hoof, and would I mind draining it for him? And I thought, well, I'm no veterinarian, but I also am sort of barely a doctor. I might as well get the experience, And so, when in doubt, cut it out. And so I went out to his little pasture with him, and he tied up the calf to 4 posts so the legs were immobile. I thought, oh, that's good. I won't get kicked. So I go over and look at this calf, and there were 3 little normal looking hoofs, and there was a hoof that looked like this. And I thought, what has he got me into here, And so I thought, well, at least the calf's restrained, this will be safe. So I touch it, and the calf just went nuts and started kicking everywhere, and he might as well not have been tied up. I mean, it's amazing the pain response there. And so, of course, I did what all young residents do. I said, well, just hold still and suck him in. No mercy at that point in life, And so it was shocking how much came out of that abscess. And I would say literally like 2 buckets of, of purulent matter, shall we say. And so, but then he was fine. Then all of a sudden he was like, well, I'm ready to go eat. And it was incredible how quickly that is, but it's amazing what can be in a boil. And thinking about these boils, it's a big deal. Yes.
My only question is, I wish that you could give anesthesia.
That do what?
Anesthesia.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, I would now, because now I have more experience. Back then, my human subjects were the worst ones probably, but yeah, giving him anesthesia is what she said. And actually, I'm trying to remember, I think that my friend had given him a shot of some sort, because he had to sort of sedate him to get him tied up. And I think he was actually sedated. It's just, it still was so painful. And it's just amazing. Yes?
Norm, is the reason why that Moses used the soot, the ash from a furnace
Oh,
to
good
throw
question.
up? Is it because back when Job when he was to relieve the boils, that the
Mhm.
science at that time was furnace or soot, coals.
Absolutely, from the fire, yes. And so I want to emphasize what his question is, why was soot used? Is it similar to the experience Job had with boils on his skin, where he used the ash from the fire, from the coals, to rub on it? And that is exactly right. Save me the next question, because my question was going to be, why soot? What power does that show? And it's because soot was possibly the only thing considered sterile in the land of Egypt or anywhere else, because once something had been burned and everybody knew it was the burned down product that had inert activity. You don't plant soot and grow more fires, right? You know, it is absolutely an inert, broken down. Of course, we know now soot or ash is just carbon debris, and carbon is a chemical basis of life if God provides that life. But the burned up carbon is a different form that doesn't exist within the human system or animal system as a life-giving molecule. And so, or in that case, element as part of the molecules. But I think it's really interesting that he chose soot, because soot would have been expected to be the treatment for a boil, because if you pack it with inert matter, cover it so that nothing else can get in, no flies, for instance, and it can allow healing to the tissue. And there's something about the carbon that, while inert, it also stimulates fibrin in the body to go heal the wound. And so if you get fibrin coming out of the, from within the bloodstream of the body to heal the wound, which would make a scab, that it took away the ability for them to treat, because the soot itself was the infectious agent. And I think that's a fascinating way to attack the theoretical power of ISIS, to say she can't protect you with the most protective thing that you know of. And I think that was absolutely what it was about. Yes?
My mother-in-law had a remedy for boils. She said, "Oh, let me get some potato," and she just got a raw potato and put it on there, and that thing drew the pus out.
Yeah, it's interesting. She mentioned the home remedy, the old-time remedy, which probably is still a now-time remedy, putting a raw potato on a wound. There are various, if you've ever watched one of the Bugs Bunny documentaries, you'll notice that when there's a wound on the head, they'll put a raw steak on it. And the idea, at least I don't know where the idea of the raw steak came from, but the idea of the raw potato is that it has high levels of potassium, which tends to be anti-infective. Potassium's a salt. So it puts salt on the wound, and it theoretically draws out the wound because it covers it so the body can attack it from inside. So it doesn't really draw from the wound like people talk about, but it allows the wound to heal enough that it starts to fill in from below. So that is an interesting aspect, which may speak to why did he say that take handfuls of soot from a furnace. So you're talking about, I don't know how many, let's just say it's 12, one for every tribe. And toss it in the air, and it'll become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt. So I believe that soot covered the land. And if you've ever been around a volcano, you know how it just literally covers everything when there's ash up in the air. And it all looks like desolate, non-living earth. And I think it covered everything because it took away every medicinal product. And whether that was aloe, potato, steak, whatever, to heal these wounds, it was all covered in soot, which was giving them wounds. So I think that's an amazing way that God attacked the goddess Isis. And I think the idea that she was the goddess of medicine and peace was that it took away all the peace, even of these officials. The magicians were sort of like the cabinet members, we'd say today. They were the advisors to Pharaoh. They were his closest allies, presumably. They seemed to have these magical arts because they participated in godless, false god issues, with Pharaoh being the chief of the false gods, which we'll get to at the 10th plague. But he believed in the power of these magicians, and he believed in their counsel, and he believed in their replication of the first two plagues, I think. Or at least he thought the people wanted to believe in it and needed to. And I think it's fascinating that even the magicians, verse 11, could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them. You know what it takes for you to not stand up in a position of power when you're leading a nation of power? It takes a lot. I'll tell you, I haven't been in that spot, I'll admit. I've never been the leader of a nation to where I had to stand up there with a boil. But I can imagine that was very, very difficult in terms of trying to show power to the people and being unable to do so. Yes?
I just want to say there might be a distinction here between the livestock and the animals. Because
Yeah.
not all livestock are animals, but not all animals are
Absolutely,
livestock.
yes. And so looking, for instance, at the plague on the livestock, he does specify the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats. He didn't mention like the wolf, the
And the
fox,
deer.
the whatever. Yeah, you're right, yes.
So it says men and animals. Does that mean women didn't get the bulls?
No, that's a great question. I love that question,
I always
actually.
get them and she never does.
Today, yes, it means that. No, his question, for the sake of the tape, was when it says the men and animals, does that leave the women out? And that he always gets things and she doesn't. But it is interesting. The translation I'm reading from is the NIV from 1984 that almost always has a gender pronoun, uses men or man or he or him. And the newer 2011 NIV does interpret all those, almost all of them, as people, because it properly is. It was people, and I think that's an important thing when we find, for instance, all men will know that I am God. That God didn't mean only men would know He's God. He meant all people, and that's an older term, of course. And so, but that's a fair question. Today, that's true. You get the abscesses, but it's that term though is a little different in interpretation. Yes. Did you have another comment? Did you have a hand up? Okay.
But you
We're
know,
gonna
when you
wrap
read
up. What?
When you read the Bible, though,
Yeah.
if you're not really knowing all the background of every term and all that,
Sure.
a person that's a newly Christian would not know that.
Yes, and that's part of why NIV decided to update the translation. Let me just spend 1 minute, if you got a minute, and I know we're over time, on translations of the Bible, because I think it's very important to realize that. So, in very, 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 very brief, and we have much more detail we could go into, but the Old Testament is written almost all in Hebrew. New Testament almost all in Greek and some Aramaic. And Greek was the written word of the day, is why it was written in Greek. People spoke Aramaic, so you have the occasional comment made that's in Aramaic, like Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani of Jesus on the cross was Aramaic because he was speaking. And it was written as the rest of it as Greek, but then he was quoted in Aramaic. So it's largely Hebrew and Greek. So as the Roman Empire took over and started using Latin as a language, eventually the Latin Vulgate was made, which was a Latin interpretation of Hebrew and Greek. And some of the people, almost all, who did it were very familiar with Scripture. It was largely Jewish philosophers and rabbis and teachers, law, scribes. All the people we read about in the Bible were responsible for translating Hebrew and Greek into Latin. But that Latin translation was based on the era of the day, which was Roman Empire, men matter, women don't matter, children rarely get mentioned. And it's amazing to me we have as much information about women and children in the Bible as we do, because in the era it was very difficult for that to have any prominence, because in their culture it had none. So when the King James Version was put out 400 and a few years ago, it was a translation into English of the King's English in England from the Latin Vulgate, not from Hebrew and Greek. Now, since then, other versions, Revised Standard, American Standard, a few others, and the NIV are actually translations into English from Hebrew and Greek. So there are some minor differences between the Latin translation that went into English and the Hebrew and Greek that goes into English. But as you know, as well as I do, that if you read English from 1600, it's very different than it is in 2022. And we all talk in ways of things like Leviathans and thou amongst us art whatever. We just have a updated language, and we are different in American language than in British language, and so the reason the NIV was translated initially, and by the way, there were, I believe it was 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly, members of the Church of Christ who were on the translation committee. They had about 90 people on the translation committee to make sure they all agreed with one another on how Hebrew and Greek translates to English. Well, when that was done, that in 1984 was finished, it started in about 1971. During that time, there was not a whole lot of mention of women in even our society. That was still an era where men were the dominant alpha members of society. And a lot of the translation became, like I was saying, that there would be the use of the pronoun he who does not work does not eat. That they realized after a few years really doesn't pertain only to men, and it should be translated people who do not work do not eat. And so there was a little bit of being up in arms about, oh, this is changing the translation. Well, it's not changing the translation, it's updating the language. I prefer not speaking Hebrew or Greek, largely because I don't speak either one. And I think it would make it very difficult to communicate. If we can communicate in modern day English in a reasonable way that pertains doctrinally speaking, I think it's perfectly fair. I only use the 84 King James said the 2011 because I own it. And if I lose it or get stolen or whatever, like Chad was talking about a couple weeks ago, I would get the newer version because now you can't get the older version except, in a used bookstore or whatever. And I think that's okay. I don't think it changed anything doctrinal. It only updated some of the English language use. And there are a few words that are different that will change probably in the future too. I'm guessing there'll be the interjection of a few terms we don't use now. Like I was saying about Robbie's sermon this morning about breaking bread. I would strongly suspect, in fact, if you read like today's English version or the Living Bible or any of those, it tends to talk about they had a meal together. It wasn't they broke bread. Because we don't say to our family, come on to the table at 6, it's time to break bread. We say it's time to eat a meal, it's time to eat dinner. And those things are okay. They don't change the fact that Jesus died for you, his blood sufficient for all. Thank you for bearing with me. We're running late. I better let you go. See you next week. Thanks. Bye.